So this is endocrine and metabolism part 2, and we're talking about type 1 versus type 2 diabetes. So in type 1, there's occasionally, but usually no family history, where type 2 that's strong. There are certain ethnic groups with type 2, where type 1 it's kind of all across the board. You will get that polydipsia, polyuria, polyphagia with weight loss in type 1. And that weight loss is because you get dehydrated from trying to get rid of the sugar in the urine. You can get that in type 2, but not as much. And unless you go into DKA, to diabetic ketoacidosis, you probably won't notice the weight loss because you're usually talking about somebody who's obese, which is not true in type 1. So type 1, most often it's children, and type 2, it's usually older children or adults. And type 2 used to be something we didn't talk about with kids at all, but we are starting to see it in many of our teens. It can be just an incidental finding when they're doing a urinalysis for type 2. That's not going to be true of type 1. Usually, type 2, it just kind of comes on. Type 1, it usually follows acute flu illness, and the thought is that's what attacks the pancreas and does the damage. So it's kind of an autoimmune thing in type 1. You destroy your pancreas. That's not true in the type 2. Diabetic ketoacidosis is common in type 1. And remember, that's a life-threatening complication of diabetes that can happen in type 2, but is not that common. It is common in type 1. You should assume, especially a brand new diabetic, type 1 diabetic, you should assume they're in ketoacidosis, which means you're not just trying to give them insulin to correct the blood sugar. Their electrolytes are out of balance to the point of being life-threatening. And if you just give a big dose of insulin and start shifting sugar around without fixing, it's a potassium level in particular, you will kill them. They will have a cardiac arrest and die. So the electrolytes have got to be managed very carefully as the blood sugar is corrected in in anybody in diabetic ketoacidosis, but in your type 1, they will probably be in DKA. Hypertension doesn't go along with type 1. The lines, right, the pigment in the skin, lipids, none of that's related, where that's very common with type 2. So I was telling you diabetic ketoacidosis is common in type 1. So this is where, because you don't have insulin, you cannot get sugar inside the cells. So the body starts using alternative sources, which is fat and protein. Particularly the fat makes these incredibly acidic ketones as a waste product. So the body will try and get rid of it in the urine and in, exhaling in the through the lungs. So you get that ketone breath and ketonuria. And this is why they end up so dehydrated. They're dumping out tons of urine with all that sugar in it. So ketones are a strong acid, right? An acid means a low pH. So you're going to see that low pH, and they're going to progressively deteriorate, getting more and more dehydrated, more and more electrolyte imbalance, more and more acidotic, which will eventually lead to coma and death. So our goals with diabetes is we're talking about kids, right? So we want normal growth and development, optimal glucose control, including those electrolytes, Try and get near normal hemoglobin A1Cs, right? That's our 3-month picture of what their blood sugars are doing. Prevent complications. All those complications of diabetes are from high blood sugar over time. And then promoting positive adjustment to the disease, self-management, and just helping them in dealing with being a kid who has something that none of their friends have. So, insulins. Let's talk about insulins. Anymore we have rapid acting, which starts to work within 15 minutes, which means that food should be there. By the time you eat and absorb, 15 minutes, the food needs to be there when you're giving this. The peak, so it doesn't just start working, but the peak working time begins at 30 minutes, 30 to 90 minutes, and then it'll keep working but tail off over 3 to 5 hours. Short acting is our regular insulin, and this used to be, now we have the rapid, which is faster. So short acting, onset takes 30 to 60 minutes for it to start working. The peak is going to be about 2 hours after you give it and keep working at its peak for 4 hours and then last for up to 8 hours. Intermediate, this is NPH, right? This doesn't start working at all till somewhere between 1 and 3 hours. The peak time begins right about when the regular peak ends. So 4 to 10 hours is when it's at its best, but it'll keep working anywhere from 10 to 16 hours. There are these ranges are because everybody's different. And if you look in a different text, sometimes, especially those durations may be a little different, because it just depends on the study, because everybody's different, who was in that study. And then we have our long acting, and these take, an hour to 2 to start working at all, and there is no real peak. Once it starts working, it just kind of works at the same level, usually for up to 24 hours, but again, there could be a lot of variation. So the complications of diabetes, well, I guess let me just say it's really important to know when you're giving insulin when it's going to start working and when it's going to peak, because hypoglycemia is, you can kill somebody quickly with too much insulin. So you need to know when you're looking at that insulin to have peaked. So complications, right? Vision, retinopathy, nerve damage, neuropathy, can be pain, can be no feeling, lipids, blood pressure, GI issues, celiac disease, hypothyroidism. Those can all be complications from long-term high blood pressure or high glucose levels. So some of the teaching points, kids, we want them doing self-monitoring of blood glucose. We usually teach them urine ketone testing as well, but that is not as accurate, and it's kind of only when they're sick we'll have them check it. We want them knowing how to use their medications, their insulin. And then we really want them to know signs and symptoms of hyper and hypoglycemia. When in doubt, treat it as hypo. If somebody's hyper and you give them some sugar, you didn't help them, but it's not that big a deal. If somebody's hypo and you don't give them sugar, they can die. So treat hypo until you find out otherwise. And we want them monitoring complications. When they're sick, their insulin needs are going to change. Stress hormones actually raise your blood sugar, but you don't eat usually when you're sick. So it's really hard to know what their blood sugar is going to do, but they usually should continue taking their insulin when they're sick. They just are going to have to adjust it a bit, perhaps. Lab testing, follow-up care, diet, and exercise. With type 1, we're not going to ever try and control their diabetes with diet and exercise, but most of the time we do carb counting with their diet, so we have them look at what they're going to eat, figure out how many carbs that is, how much insulin they need to cover those carbs, rather than just taking in the morning you take this much, as we make it specific to what they're going to eat. When they exercise, right, that increased metabolism uses up more blood sugar, so they're at risk of going hypoglycemic. So when they're exercising, we want them to have a sugar source with them, just in case they drop low and have to treat that. Kids pretty young, 8-10 years old, can do their own. Here they're monitoring the blood sugar, and here he's giving his own injections. And this is what we're really going to. At least in pediatrics, we love the pens. You don't mix these. You turn this dial back here, and there's a little window, you can't see it, that has the number, so you can't get the units wrong. You look at the little picture in the window and it says 2 or 3. These do come, pretty much all your insulins come in a pen now, so you got to make sure you have the right one, but it's much more accurate. And usually in pediatrics, our goal is to get them on multiple doses a day of short-acting or rapid-acting insulin in order to switch them over to a pump. And the pump really does the best job with diabetes control, glycemic control, because we figure out what this child's basal metabolic need is, and the pump is always giving that. And then they look at what they're going to eat and punch in, give me this many extra units. Or they check their blood sugar before they eat and say, gosh, I must have, had some extra sugar yesterday or whatever. And so they can punch in that little bit extra. So it's just better. We're not having meds, kind of peak and then taper off and spike and drop. It's just constant, and you put in more when you need more when you eat. This is a relatively new thing that is out there. I don't know how many insurances are paying for it yet, but this is a continuous blood sugar monitor. And at this point, the people I know who have it, it vibrates or makes their pump vibrate or makes their phone vibrate, somehow lets them know whenever they're outside of parameters, either high or low, and then they're supposed to do a finger stick to check and make sure and see where they are. The goal is someday this is going to be just like your pancreas. This is going to say, oh, you went up a little, give an extra unit. Oh, you went down a little, hold off for a half hour, given anything, and now we'll get back to your basal metabolic rate going, and that these two will talk to each other. And, so this is continually monitoring your blood sugar, and this is responding to what it is, just like the pancreas does for the rest of us. So that's kind of where we're going. At this point, it exists and it's out there, but it's not available to everyone.